Hi there, I'm Amanda Castor with Material Girl Quilts. Today I'm back to share another pre-cut friendly quilt tutorial with you. This quilt uses pre-cut 10-inch squares or layer cakes and is called Star Chain. It is a beginner friendly pattern, but also a pattern I think all level of quilt makers will enjoy. This quilt also comes in two different sizes. You can either complete a 72-inch square quilt like I did with the one behind me, or you can piece yours into a 60-inch by 84-inch quilt. So all you'll need to do is select your favorite layer cake and some background fabric, and let's get started. Now we're going to start by cutting our pre-cut 10-inch squares. So the first thing you'll do is select 18 of those that are going to be cut up into the various 2.5-inch squares throughout the quilt. So the first cut we'll make, or I find it easiest to do this in halves. So I line up on the 5-inch line on the outside edge, cut, and then take it over to the 2.5-inch and cut, and then I'll set this aside and then line up 2.5, cut those squares, and you continue this way to cut the remaining 2.5 squares from this section. And we'll repeat the same process for the other rectangle that we've cut. So we'll go over on the 2.5-inch mark, cut, and continue up, cutting 2.5-inch squares. This will result in a total of 16 2.5-inch squares from each of your 18 pre-cut 10-inch squares. Now you will select either 17 of your pre-cut squares if you're making the 60 by 84-inch quilt, or 18 of those squares, and we will cut as shown. So first we're going to start by lining up the 5-inch along the edge and cutting vertically in the middle, and line up again on the bottom and cut horizontally through the center. And then you will select one of those, oops, we missed a little piece here, looks like one of those squares, and set them aside. Now the remainder of these squares you will go ahead and cut into more 2.5-inch squares. So I'm going to cut up along the bottom here to cut those into 2.5-inch. Across the side, there's 4, and then I will line this up again on 2.5-inch. Here's 4 more, and we have 1 more cut to make. So this gives you 12 2.5-inch squares, and then this remaining larger square, what you're going to do with it is cut it down to 4.5 inches. And I'm flipping my ruler so I can get the 4.5-inch mark on both sides. Now you will follow the pattern instructions for how much of the background fabric you need to cut for your blocks. And I'll go ahead and show you how we're going to piece those blocks next. Okay, we are going to start with the piecing of the star block. So the first thing we need to do when we piece this block is to actually piece these points for the stars. Now, as you'll note in my quilt, I opted to go scrappier and make the points of my stars different fabric from the center of the stars. If you would like yours to be the same color, then you just need to plan ahead and make sure that you are creating the flying geese points that match the center squares that you have available. So let's go ahead and make those points. What you'll need to do is select a 4.5-inch by 2.5-inch rectangle in one of your star point fabrics, a 2.5-inch square. You will place those right sides together on one end of the rectangle, and then you're going to draw a line on the diagonal and sew directly on the line as I've done here. I didn't draw the line, I just used the guide on my sewing machine. And once that's done, you're going to trim 1/4 inch off beyond that sewn line. Trim that off, and then you will press towards the triangle. Now once that has been pressed, then you're going to go to the opposite corner and take another one of your point fabric squares, lay them right sides together, and again sew directly on this diagonal line as I've done here. And then once again trim off the excess at 1/4 inch, and then you will press that open to have your completed flying geese, which will be one side of the points for your star. So you'll repeat this process to make a total of 4 of these flying geese per star block that you need. Now once all of the flying geese are prepared for your star blocks, it's time to piece the center star of that block together. So you will sew them into 3 different rows. So you'll add your 2.5 inch background squares to the outsides of these flying geese, and in the center of these 2 flying geese you will add your center star square. Now once we piece those together, I will show you how I pressed each row. I pressed the top and bottoms, I pressed out towards the background fabric, and then the center row I pressed in towards the center star fabric. So once you get those sewn into 3 rows, then you will sew the 3 rows together to complete the star. And here is what that will look like. Now we need to add the rest of the background and 2.5 inch squares to complete this block. So what you'll do next is lay this out with 4 of the 8.5 inch by 2.5 inch rectangles of the background fabric and 4 of your 2.5 inch squares, and lay it out in this format, and then you'll sew this into 3 separate rows. So your top row will be up here with the 2 background, or the 2.5 inch squares and 1 of the background rectangles, your star with 2 background rectangles, and again here's your last row that you will sew together. You will then sew those rows together to complete the block. The completed block will measure 12.5 inches, and I will show you how I pressed the fabrics on the back after the star was completed. I then pressed towards the background fabric for the top and bottom rows, and then when I pressed the piece the star into the center row, I pressed towards the background fabric again so that my seams could nest at each of the corners. Okay, for our chain blocks, what we're going to need are 12 different 2.5 inch squares, 4 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch background rectangles, and 4 2.5 inch by 8.5 inch rectangles. So what we will first do is piece the center of this chain block. We will select 4 of our 2.5 inch squares and piece them into a 4 patch. Sorry, I pressed the seams for these in opposite directions so that the seams could nest, and then I pressed the center seam open. Next, after that, you will then sew your 4.5 inch by 2.5 inch rectangles to the outsides of that center 4 patch. And once those are sewn, you will then take sections where you have sewn 2.5 inch squares to each end of a 4.5 inch rectangle, and you will sew those onto the top and bottom of that pieced unit. Then you will add 8.5 inch by 2.5 inch rectangles to the outsides of your completed section, and you will finish it off with 8.5 inch background rectangles with the 2.5 inch squares pieced on each end, and again we press towards the background fabric here. And then you will sew those to the top and bottom of your block. And then I will show you what the completed block will look like here. And it again finishes at 12.5 inches squares once it's completely pieced. So you will repeat this to make a total of 18 of your chain blocks. Once all of your blocks are completed, you will lay them out as shown, alternating between the star and chain blocks. If you're doing the 72-inch square quilt, you will lay them out in 6 blocks per row in a total of 6 rows. If you would like to do the 60-inch by 84-inch quilt, you will lay them out in 5 blocks per row for a total of 7 rows. And here's another diagram that shows what this quilt would look like if you did not do the scrappy star version. As a reminder, there's a link to a printable pattern in the video description below, as well as all of the materials that I used for this quilt. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you did, please click the like button and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any tutorials going forward. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.